Welcome to a new episode of Melt. I'm Ritvika Gupta. On the show this week, we are talking behavioral and entrepreneurial sciences and how study and research in these fields can help brands and marketers. To know more, Anant Rangaswami, editor of Melt, will be in conversation today with RJ Youngling, CEO of Youngling Research, a Netherlands-based firm that helps bootstrappers build profitable companies faster and consults for brands to help them solve behavioral problems with customers. Let's get ready to melt with RJ Youngling.
Hi, RJ.
What's going on? Great to see you.
Good to see you. Today we're going to talk about something very unusual. We are going to talk about facts and non-facts and about truths and non-truths almost. And my viewers are going to discover how you're going to teach them how to find those facts and non-facts and truths and non-truths and how it will help them. So to start off...
In 22 minutes.
Yeah. So to start off, RJ, tell us what you do as an entrepreneurial scientist.
Yeah. Like you said, I'm an entrepreneurial scientist. So that means that I do research in entrepreneurship through a mixture of various fields. So you can think of things like consumer psychology, social psychology, behavioral sciences, a little bit of mathematics, so stuff like game theory as well. But in a nutshell, the easiest way to explain it is, you know how it's difficult for companies to solve their own marketing issues because there's just the sheer amount of misinformation that they don't know what's true and what's false. What we do is we have a process which is based on the literature, so based on like scientific research that helps companies market better, market correctly in order to prevent them from wasting money.
Now, in the conversation that you and I had a couple of weeks ago, it was not only help them market better, sometimes it's also helped them figure out whether the business premises are correct.
Yeah.
So can you expand on that?
Yeah, what you said is 100% true. But something that I also teach and when I work with the companies is that the way in which you're communicating about the value proposition of your company needs to be succinct. It's better to be slightly imprecise, but snappy versus very long-winded, but correct because people won't have a label. So that's why, depending on the audience, I tweak the way that I explain what Youngling Research does. But yeah, entrepreneurial sciences essentially like entails the entire company. So everything that you can do in order to make the company better. I will say that we, Youngling Research, we don't spend as much time on like the rational solutions because most of the time the companies, they can't figure that out themselves. Or they are able to hire someone like a McKinsey firm or any of the big consulting firms to help them with like the rational problem. So it's somewhat rare for like the obvious solutions to be a big problem.
Right. What about assumptions? A lot of mistakes are made because of false assumptions. So tell me how you check those, how important it is to check those.
Yes. It's funny that you say that because that's a different matter entirely. It's incredibly important for companies to really be aware of the assumptions that they're making. Obviously, because the assumptions that you're making need not be true. You hope they are, but oftentimes you don't know. If you do happen to make an assumption in your company and it turns out to be flawed, that's fine because at least you're aware of it. That's in some sense how the scientific process works. You make an assumption and you double check. However, the problem with a lot of the companies is that the things that they are doing are a function of a certain assumption that has been made, but no one ever checked it, nor is anyone aware that a certain assumption exists. And now you have a situation where you can run into huge problems because you're doing things that follow from a certain assumption that is not true.
So can you give me an example of the assumption?
Yeah, there are tons of examples that I can give, but a while ago, beginning of last year, we worked with a big bank in the Netherlands, and they had a difficulty getting their consumers to use their beautifully designed app. And sometimes I tease engineers, like the more technical people, because they have this perspective, this point of view that every solution can be solved through technology. And that would be the case if, again, you make an assumption, and that assumption is human beings are robots, but human beings are human beings. So, you need to make decisions that are correct for human beings and not for machines. So they had this beautiful app. They did their research and they concluded that if they could help their consumers, their users save more money, it would be better for them. They would stick around longer, less churn, yada, yada, yada. But what they did is they figured that, okay, if we make a gorgeous app, beautiful design, it works flawlessly, then people will use it. That's an assumption, and it turned out that that was a bad assumption. So what we did is we figured out, okay, what's actually, what is the thing that we're actually trying to accomplish here? And for them, it was, okay, can we get people to save at least somewhere in the range of 5 to 10,000 euros? That was the goal. That is not a behavior that a consumer can execute. The average consumer doesn't have $5,000 or $10,000 like laying around that they can put into their savings account. So we said, okay, what's a behavior that we can do right now, that we can help them do right now? How can we make it easier for them? So what we did is we said, okay, let's go through a few different approaches that we can take in order to facilitate that goal, which we did. And we came up with, okay, let's do a prompt. In behavior science, it's called a contextual prompt, which prompts the user to say, okay, hey, whenever you get a payment, can you save just €1? So they got a prompt whenever money was arrived into their bank account. They saw this prompt, hey, can you save €1 right now? And we saw some, I can't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but I believe it was somewhere in the range of like 1100% increase in the people who saved it, simply because they didn't remember to do it. So the prompt worked, but also we made the behavior very easy to do. Whereas previously, they were asking way too much of the average consumer.
Another example you gave me was in the food delivery business and so on. Grocery deliveries, food deliveries, where they promise you delivery in 20 minutes and 10 minutes. And you were talking about the dangers of assumptions there, and not quite the dangers, the complexity of assumptions there. So can you talk us through that?
Yeah, certainly. So right now, in the city where I live, there's an arms race going on between a number of companies who have the same value proposition. And the value proposition is, hey, we can get you anything you need from the grocery store within, say, 10 minutes or so, and it's going to cost you €1.80 in order to get it delivered to you. So the value proposition is, you don't have to go to the supermarket. It's a little less than €2. So it doesn't cost you that much extra, and there's a lot of convenience. People just assume this stuff, and I get it, because it's we can get into evolutionary psychology if you want to, but people tend to look left and right and see what their competitors are doing, and then they mimic that behavior. And here you have a situation where this can have pretty profound implications, because you don't necessarily know whether or not that's the most important value proposition to your consumer. Arguably, there are a lot of people that might not use your app because it's so fast, because that's an assumption that they're making. I believe the specific value proposition that's often used in the marketing material of all of these companies is something like you're cooking, you realize that you forgot the salt or whatever, call us and we'll bring it to you. But it's like a very niche use case. So how sure are you that people are using it for that particular reason? My behavior science experience and education would say, okay, probably the more logical explanation, the more likely explanation to be correct, is that people are simply lazy. Because lazy and the removal of friction is a much bigger driver of behavior. So what I think is going on is that people say, hey, it's late, I can't be bothered to get into my car, it's raining, it's cold, I don't want to go to the supermarket. If I can just use these guys and send them a text message in the app, or order my stuff via the app, have it show up on my door, that's great, because that's essentially like delivery. And now you can do different things, because if that's true, if you test it and it turns out to be correct, and I'm fairly sure that that's the most likely explanation in terms of value proposition. Now that means that you can free up some time, because instead of having to deliver it inside of 10 minutes, maybe the consumer is fine with 30 minutes, or maybe even an hour, depending on how you communicate it. So there's in behavioral economics, there are certain things that you can do, with the map. So you remove the uncertainty of how long it's going to take, etc. Also something we can get into if you want. But if you do that, now suddenly, you have a drastic decrease in the cost, because you don't have to get every delivery from your warehouse, or your mini warehouse is what they use, to the door of the consumer in a space of 10 minutes, which is, it's challenging, and it has a lot of cost. And if that's not necessarily what the consumer wants you to do, you're wasting money.
What are the kind of brands or companies which contact you, and why do they contact you?
If you want to learn physics, you wouldn't go to someone who has knowledge about astrology. You would go to someone who has insights and education based around physics, obviously. And for some reason, in the entrepreneurship world, we don't do that, and that's a very big problem. Specifically because this domain is so tricky. It's tricky because sometimes the effects can be very small, so that makes it difficult to discern whether or not a certain intervention is working. But also, like just sheer the ability to replicate a particular finding, a particular experiment is challenging because there are so many variables. You have confounding variables, you have variables which you cannot control. So all of these factors combined make it very easy for people to hide in the clutter and hide in the mess, even though they don't know what they're doing essentially. So when companies reach out to us, it's because they trust us, they trust Youngling Research in order that we have insights and experience and expertise in order to discern something that's true from something that is false.
Right. Now tell me, typically, who do you work with? Do you work with the CMO, the CTO, the CEO, the founders themselves? Who do you work with? Who's the person who actually has the pain, whose pain it is?
Yeah, roughly equal among three different sets. So we do some firm work with the big firms, and we work with a brand that sold chocolate, had certain issues there, which we helped them solve. A lot of work in the startup scene, which is where my background lies essentially. And then we also do some work with bootstrappers. But in terms of consulting and in terms of workshops, it's mainly the first two categories. So the big brands essentially, and the startup world.
Within the big brands or the startup, who's the human being who takes the decision? Is it the founder or the CEO, or is it the marketing team?
70% of the time it's like the CMO. Sometimes it's the CEO, but most of the times, they are very busy. So usually it's like the CMO.
And in the startup world, is it the founders?
Most of the time it's also still the CMO. It kind of depends on, are we talking early stage, very early stage, or are we talking about the companies, it's past what we call product market fit. So they have already identified all of the components of the business model correctly. And then if that's not the case, then we will work closer with the founder usually. By the way, it's important for me to stress that that even though that's the case, that might not necessarily be the most ideal case.
That's an assumption we're making. That
Yeah.
it is. When I first started following you on Twitter and tried to understand what you did, I'd never heard of entrepreneurial sciences before. So
yeah.
Obviously I've seen what people like Rory Sutherland are doing or Dave Trott is doing. So in an advertising agency kind of context, would you call yourself a planner?
That's a good question. I can see why you say that. I think as an analogy, it makes sense. However, the average planner doesn't have the insights that I have, that we have in Youngling Research when it comes to the various fields. It's essentially just like how the behavioral sciences are a intersection of various sets, of psychology, of economics, various fields, and then you have the intersection, and that is now known as behavioral sciences. Richard Taylor, Danny Kahneman, all of those guys. It's slightly similar because you need to have insights when it comes to consumer psychology. You need to understand a little bit of game theory to understand what's going on the macro. A little bit of information there helps you understand and helps you think through things like how important is it to be the first to market, or is it okay to be a later entrant? So as an analogy, it works, but in reality, it's a little bit broader. It's the intersection of various sets. Everything that you do when it comes to entrepreneurial science is focused on one thing, how can you help the company do better? How can you make a company perform better, essentially?
How do you get compensated? Is it a fee, or is it a percentage of a delta or something like that? What is it? How do they pay you?
Yeah, it's funny that you say that because a few years ago, maybe like 6 years ago or something, I actually tried a fee structure, but that's part of testing the business model and seeing what works and what gives you the results that you're looking for. But no, everything is a fee. Everything is based on a fee structure. We do have some products, for example, the Youngling Research cohort and YRC Deep. Which are the first one is a live 12-week bootcamp where we help bootstrappers, get from zero to a company that's pays them enough in order to be able to live off of. And the second one, YRC Deep, is like a long education into various fields. Those two are memberships. But aside from that, it's either like workshops and bootcamps, which have a fee structure, or it's like a consulting gig, which also has a fee structure.
Right. Now, tell me how many of the companies that you consult for have entrepreneurial scientists within their own organization, and why don't they if they don't have?
Pretty much none. And why don't they? Right now, the main education that people inside of companies can get, whether we're talking about someone who has a position in a company which is already established, so maybe like a big firm or maybe a startup which has now entered the stage of scale up, it's probably going to be something like an MBA. There are, for example, in Tilburg, the city that I live in, we have entrepreneurship programs, so it's starting to become more popular, but yeah, it's just not there yet. It's all still quite young. As to why, to be honest, I'm not 100% sure. I think it's just because it's partly because it's just such a complicated field. When it comes to something like physics, for example, you benefit from the fact that a lot of variables, you can neglect those variables and get a reasonable approximation of reality with very few variables. So if I take this pencil here and I drop it, there's air resistance. This pencil is made up of an immense number of particles, but all of those realities don't matter when it comes to like mapping or trying to deduce the behavior of when I drop this pencil. In entrepreneurship, that isn't the case. There are so many variables, and oftentimes they are what is called non-linear. So you have something which is called a complex adaptive system, to use the fancy terminology, which essentially means that you have variables interacting with other variables. And instead of having like a one-to-one relationship where you move this one and this one moves, it's more like a spider web where you pull something and everything moves. But it's very difficult ex ante to determine what will happen when you pull in a particular place. And on top of that, the spider web constantly moves. So if you do something once and then the next day you try it again, because the spider web has changed, now the output is different. So an example of that would be, say you study Facebook and you try and mimic everything that Facebook has done and you copy it, nothing will happen because Facebook already exists. So that's a situation where you run into trouble. So all of these factors combined make it challenging to not fool yourself. All these factors combined make it very hard to discern what is actually true and what is actually false. And the way you do it is you look at a vast spectrum of companies and you talk to a lot of practitioners as well. And then you make a conjecture, a guess, a hypothesis, and then you test it. And then hopefully you get something which is reasonably predictive. And now you take all of those ideas together and then you get entrepreneurial science from that.
So tell me, Youngling Research, typically, what is the kind of team that works on a company's challenge? What is the makeup, the professional makeup of that team?
Yeah, usually it's people with expertise in marketing or some subfield of marketing. So it's the people who have a general understanding of marketing strategy and those kinds of things, but also like the more tangible and tactical stuff. So for example, like copywriters, etc., if that's necessary to solve a specific problem. Aside from that, we have behavioral scientists, so people who have a very good understanding of behavioral science. And occasionally, we have people with deep expertise in mathematics who can help us out with certain kinds of problems. And then it's not like the typical mathematics, like I said, the rational problems of like, supply chain optimization. It almost never happens that a company has problems there. It happens. I shouldn't say that, It happens, but these are problems which are figure outable. You can hire someone to do that. You just hire someone with a background in econometrics or whatever, and they can fix that for you. So it's mainly problems related to marketing or problems related to influencing consumers, which is the domain of behavioral economics and behavior science.
Fantastic. So that was a lovely conversation with you, RJ. And I hope when things are better, we get you down to India.
Yeah, that would be very cool.
I hope Indian marketers can hear what entrepreneurial sciences can do for them. And I hope they can hear how complicated you can make a problem for chocolate. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you.
And that was RJ Youngling explaining how entrepreneurial science and its applications can unlock better marketing and strengthen a brand. He is now presenting the Melt cheat sheet. Marketers need to be aware of the assumptions that they are making. Entrepreneurial science helps companies to market correctly and simplify their value proposition. Entrepreneurial science provides companies with insights and expertise to discern facts from claims. On that note, let's move to this week's creative picks. As part of his Welcome Professionals campaign, LinkedIn has released a new ad that aims to spark a discussion about what it means to be a professional. The 30-second ad encourages users to update their LinkedIn profiles with an expression of their own about what professionalism means to them. This is an extension of the Welcome Professionals campaign, which LinkedIn released globally 2 months ago. The ad is relevant and comes at a time when we are already experiencing a shift in the ways we work. It is also inspiring to hear different stories and unique definitions of what it means to be a professional in today's rapidly evolving society. Take a look.
Let's talk about what is professional today. We can flip the script by getting
Professional does not have shape, does not have limits. I've been a janitor, I've been a designer, I've been an executive.
Creating my own seat at the table was doing things different than how it's ever been done before.
It's just like an ebb and a flow. Dad life, work life.
It's all life. There's work and there's what works for you.
Professional is you, professional is us.
It's ours to define.
With that, it's a wrap on this episode of Melt. You can follow us on social media. Our handle is Ready to Melt. And stay updated with all that's happening in the world of advertising and marketing with our daily Melt update on our website, readytomelt.com. I shall see you next week. Goodbye.